My teacher once told me that every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. But that's crazy. I mean, why don't they have their wings? What is there, some kind of chicken shortage in heaven? What happens during the Heaven Super Bowl? Are there just a bunch of wingless parties with boring dips? That doesn't sound like heaven to me. There we go. We're giving out free wings in this review. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you who are listening. Whether you subscribe to the channel or not, just know that you're taking the time to listen to what I have to say is really and genuinely appreciated. So here in the United States, we're just about to hit the Thanksgiving mark of our calendar. And I think given how difficult this year has been for us as a species, now more than ever is probably a good time to sort of recalibrate our perspective on life a bit. You see, there's still a tremendous amount of anger and frustration in the world, and that was only made even worse by the pandemic, which sort of forced us to become even more isolated than usual, really testing the limits of our mental health. In times like these, it can be very difficult for us to sort of see our value, our worth in the world, right? We often wonder if anybody out there would even care if we existed or not. And that sort of segues into the film that I want to talk about today. A movie that was largely panned when it came out in the theater, and for most of my life was considered to be somewhat of a joke because it used to play over and over again on TV, to the point that you would just say, you know what, I think I'll just turn on the TV, I'm sure it's on right now anyway. Now the movie that I'm talking about is Frank Capra's 1946 classic, It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed. Giving out wings. So what's this movie about? Well, I don't want to get too much into it because likely many of you have already seen it. And if you haven't seen it, I want you to experience, the whole plot line for the first time. But much of the story has been sort of ingrained in our popular culture for a while, so I'm sure you're at least somewhat familiar with what's going on. The film is essentially centered around George Bailey, a man who pretty much does everything that he can in order to help those around him, oftentimes to the detriment of his own personal dreams. Now, George runs his local family business, which is actually a business and loan, a bank, essentially. And through certain circumstances, which are not entirely his fault, I mean, Uncle Billy happens, right? I think we all know an Uncle Billy that we probably wouldn't give that much responsibility to. Let's just say that circumstances surrounding George end up sort of taking a turn for the worse, and some of the funds from the business and loan actually end up going missing. It's not too long before there is a warrant out for George's arrest, and of course, while all of this is happening, he's taking it out on his family, and there's just this seemingly never-ending, crumbling life that sits before him. It's not long before George Bailey is essentially a man just sort of in shambles, right? Believing that the entire world would be better off without him. Now, George starts wandering around the town of Bedford Falls completely drunk, and at one point he stops at a bridge where he begins to contemplate just sort of ending it all, committing suicide. Just as he's about to jump into the frozen water, someone else jumps in. Well, that someone else turns out to be Clarence, the angel. Handing out wings. You see, Clarence jumps into the water to force George to jump in, not to commit suicide, but to save Clarence. George is able to rescue Clarence the angel, but George still believes that the world would be better off if he never existed. So Clarence gives him this wish. Clarence shows George what it would be like if he had never existed. And of course, the world is not better off without George Bailey. In fact, it's much worse. It isn't long before George realizes all the value that he has done, all the goodwill that he has sort of built up over the course of his life, and he wants to go back to his original life. Of course, George goes back to his life, and we get this beautiful, amazing, heartwarming ending, which I'll leave for you to watch. Now, it's easy for us today to take a film like this for granted. We've evolved so much over the past, since 1946, with technology and philosophy and intellect, right? Clearly, we have evolved past needing such schmaltzy, warm endings like this, right? No. In fact, we need them more than ever. We shuffle through our days holding phones, but we never call anyone. We watch 24/7 news access, but we learn nothing about the world. And we listen to thousands of people talk over the internet, and we don't hear a single person. You see, what I love most about It's a Wonderful Life is that it reminds us that we exist, and that while there is still breath in our lungs, there's still plenty more good work that we need to do. Now, I'm going to make kind of a clumsy connection here, but bear with me. Whenever I'm fortunate enough to teach Hamlet to a bunch of new students, I always spend a pretty decent amount of time talking about that famous quotation, to be or not to be, that is the question. But what I try to instill within my students is the idea that if you're not careful, you can become trapped in contemplation, right? You can sit there and keep thinking about what you could have been, should have been. And the problem is you never actually act upon anything. You see, the most precious resource that any of us have is actually time. We can't buy more. We can't get any of it back. So the only real question is, what do you do with your time? As in action, not whether or not you exist. I've got some news for you. You already are. More wings. What I love about It's a Wonderful Life is that it champions the small everyday things that we do. These things like smiling, like opening a door for someone, or just sitting there and listening while somebody else lets you know their story. These things add up over the course of a lifetime, and they create a beautiful tapestry of all the good that you've created throughout your life. And that's essentially what we see in It's a Wonderful Life, is the beautiful tapestry that's created by George Bailey. So what's our silver lining lesson here? Well, I feel like I've said enough that just about any of that stuff could be our lesson. However, I think I'm just going to sum it up by saying this. You matter. Your existence matters. You don't need to justify that to anyone. Anger, frustration, these are all a part of the human experience. The important thing is that you don't get trapped in that contemplation that I was talking about earlier, and that you recognize that these small, everyday good things that you do can sometimes mean everything to the people that you love most. So, what I would tell you is this. If you've never seen It's a Wonderful Life before, give yourself a nice treat. Go ahead and watch it. And if you're like me, you have seen it before, but it's just been a while, take a moment, watch it again, and this time, really pay attention. You might find a tremendous amount of hope. There's another set of wings.